My name is Roger Berkowitz, and I'd like to welcome you to this lecture sponsored by the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. This is part 2 of a lecture called The Destiny of Freedom from Kant to Heidegger. For those of you who were here Monday, Professor Nonet led us through the close connection / identity between Kant's idea of the goodwill as the essence of duty, the will to will as freedom, which then morphs into Friedrich Nietzsche's the will as will to power. And he will, I think, review that briefly at the beginning of the lecture and then move us on to his discussion of Heidegger. Once again, Professor Nonet has a law degree from the University of Liège, and then a PhD in sociology at the University of California, Berkeley, where he taught for many years in the jurisprudence and social policy program at Berkeley, where he was my Dr. Fata, my advisor. So, without further ado, I'd like to welcome again Professor Nonet.
Well, I was planning myself to review briefly the steps through which we went last week in studying the idea of the will to will and showing that in it lies the root of the sway of modern technique over our world. We concluded with a question. If the destiny of man in modern times becomes that of laboring, that is, if labor becomes universal, then we are put before this phenomenon that Max Weber calls die herrenlose Sklaverei, the phenomenon of a slavery where there is no master. And the question arises, to what or to whom does this servitude obey? So far so good. Max Weber himself never answers that question. One answer to it, and so far the only answer known to mankind, is to be found in the thinking of Martin Heidegger. It says, the authority to which modern man has fallen into servitude is that of a law, but a law of a distinct kind, for which we have no name in English. English is very poor in its power to speak of law. It has one word, law, and is unable, therefore, to differentiate between different kinds of laws. German has greater resources in that respect. Heidegger calls the law that governs in the sway of technique das Gestell. The word is untranslatable. It is explicable, maybe, but not translatable. You can see that it is a formation of the passive participle of the verb stellen. It is formed from gestellt. Stellen means to put, to pose, to set in place. That will do for the time being. This law, as compared with laws to which we are more accustomed to think, is extraordinarily imperious. It is indeed a higher law, higher than ordinary positive law. It is a higher law to which all other law must conform. It compels, for example, all legal thinking to transform itself into the calculation of policy. Those who have read recent literature about law will be familiar with that. It does not merely guide man, rather, it summons. Stellen, in one of its senses, is to summon. It summons mankind to summon nature, and that includes man insofar as he belongs to nature, to release energy for accumulation and to be made ready for disposal. Disposing in German is bestellen. So two different senses of stellen. Bestellen, to dispose, and stellen, to summon. The kinship between these words is not explicable in English. Thus, insofar as it extends to the summoning of man, it threatens to transform man himself into a disposable resource. Disposable is bestellbar. We are all familiar with the fact that all modern organizations, at least in this country, in the English-speaking world, have a department concerning human resources. We have become human resources, period. But at the same time, as it reduces man to servitude, this law misrepresents technique. To misrepresent in German is verstellen. Third formation of stellen. All of this is included in the concept of Gestell. It misrepresents technique as an instrument in the hands of man, by means of which man enlarges his power, the power of his will, and elevates himself to lordship over the earth. Thus, it induces the metaphysical illusion of technique as promising freedom and progress through science. Imperious and deceptive as it may be, the law by virtue of which technique rules over modern man does not issue from will at all, be it the will of God or the will of man. There used to be a higher law that was the will of God, to which the will of man had to defer. The law, the higher law of which we speak as Gestell, is not the product of the will even of a God. It is no positive law at all. It is not a law that is posed. From where, or from which, or from what does das Gestell proceed then? Answer: from nowhere, from no one, and from nothing. Das Gestell can be traced to no being, kein Seiendes, no ground. It is a groundless explosion of groundless grounding. It is the most extreme irrationality of rationality. But nothing, as it is used here, is not nothing in the negative sense. Nothing, as Heidegger says, is the veil of being, der Schleier des Seins. Being, das Sein, shows itself in das Gestell, in its imperiousness as well as in its deceptiveness. Heidegger's thinking owes its depth to this insight that sets it apart from all attempts at causal explanations of modernity. It is rooted in Heidegger's profound experience of something which is indeed exceedingly difficult to translate, but I shall put it on the board now. Die Seinsverlassenheit des Seienden. Die Seinsverlassenheit des Seienden. To understand this word, we have to be able to make the distinction between Sein and Seiendes, between the gerund, the infinitive, which functions on gerund, and the participle, which functions as a noun. To complete the translation, this refers to the abandonment of das Seiende, what is, by being. The implicit thought is that things, as we know them under the sphere of technique, have in some sense been robbed of their being. Let's explain that further. Under the spell of das Gestell, we have already examined that briefly on Monday, all beings are reduced to disposable and fungible quantities of energy. In Kant and Nietzsche, already in Descartes, all things are reduced to the standing of objects, objects of scientific and technical investigation. With technique, even objects dissolve. They turn into disposable Bestand. I don't know how to translate that either. One can only say that Bestand is here used to signify the being of things that are bestellt. They become interchangeable quantities of values. Things are thus robbed of their being, Sein. They finally become the meon, that's ancient Greek for non-being, the meon to which they were destined already by Plato. Things are uprooted from their formerly essential relations to man and to God, to sky and to earth, to past and to future. They become, in other words, worldless, if world is meant here as the opening of the openness of essential differences. That is, things become truthless in a sense of truth that is yet to be accounted for. in proportion as things cease to be, man experiences a corresponding impoverishment of his own existence. This is manifest in what Max Weber called the disenchantment of the world. But he could not understand it, being stuck within the boundaries of social science. This disenchantment is the loss of all capacity to marvel, to wonder, to revere, to admire. Hence the fall of modern mankind into godlessness and into artlessness, and the corresponding debasement of language. This impoverishment of the existence of man shows itself in the massive experience of boredom from which modern man suffers to no end. Modern man needs always to be somewhere other than where he is. We are familiar with modern man's addiction to the screen of movies, the screen of TV, the screen that we carry now in these portable little gadgets with which we cannot dispense, it seems. We are familiar also with all the gadgets by which we listen to things other than those that we could hear if we opened our ears to what is here now. We have an earphone in our head which blasts barbarian noise into our mind. And we are caught up all the time in a feverish need for stimulation, entertainment, novelty, and so forth. The ground of all this is the boredom we experience because of die Seinsverlassenheit des Seienden, the abandonment of beings by being. But this Seinsverlassenheit is at bottom nothing only to bemoan or to regard as negative. Das Gestell is in fact the first appearance, in disguise to be sure, of the law in the sense of Gesetz, of the mutual belonging of me being, Sein, and man. The law of the mutual belonging of being and man. Heidegger calls that law das Ereignis. Another word which is untranslatable. It is that by virtue of which being owns man and man owns being. They belong to one another. To be owned in German is eignen, from which the word Eignis comes. Das Gestell, says Heidegger, is the veil of das Ereignis. This is shown by all three features of it that we have so far outlined. The imperiousness of das Gestell shows how being lays a claim upon the service of man. It demands that man attend to the unconcealment of beings, to their revelation, their making manifest, to the unconcealment of beings in the openness of the truth of being. die Wahrheit des Seins, understood as aletheia. I'll just write it. Aletheia. Aletheia means unconcealedness. It is also called by Heidegger die Lichtung des Seins, that is, the clearing of being. Technique is, at bottom, a mode of such unconcealment, a mode of the revelation, the making manifest of things under a certain aspect, to be sure. Second, the deceptiveness of das Gestell reveals how being denies itself unconcealment in its own truth. Shall I repeat that? Being denies itself unconcealment in its own truth. It remains, therefore, hidden, concealed. And by virtue of its concealment, it can send man on the pursuit of misleading metaphysical representations of its essence. The truth of being, Sein, therefore entails the unconcealment of its concealment. This concealment always runs the risk of inducing man's oblivion of being, and thus furthering distortions of man's own essence as the being who speaks and uncovers beings in speech. Third, being's abandonment of beings, das die Seinsverlassenheit des Seienden, reveals how man's own flourishing depends upon the richness of the world he inhabits, and thus upon the care with which he serves the truth of being, aletheia, unconcealment. This service of truth is no servitude, though it is service. Das Gestell brings servitude only because it is exclusive of so many other ways of unconcealment, other than the unconcealment of disposable energy. Because of its exclusiveness, it distorts and threatens the essence of man. Technique is in fact only one mode of the unconcealment of beings. Thus, the service of truth is no servitude. On the contrary, as we shall see, and this is the last key point to be made tonight, the service of truth is nothing other than the service of freedom. To be free, Heidegger says, is to belong in the property of beings, das Eigentum des Seins. Das Eigentum des Seins, the property of being, in the sense of das Sein, is the truth as clearing of the concealment of being. Okay? The truth as clearing of the concealment of being. Kant already knew the identity between freedom and truth. You will see it in his demonstration of the existence of freedom in the 3rd chapter of the Grundlegung. Indeed, he thought of thinking in its essence as willing. Therefore, he thought of truth, which is an attribute of thinking in his mind, is identical with freedom, which he thinks of as an attribute of the will. Since the will is the same as thought, it follows that truth and freedom are the same as well. Kant, therefore, remained committed to the traditional concept of truth as an attribute of thought. The attribute of thought that truth refers to in traditional metaphysics since Aristotle is in Latin, the adequatio intellectus ad rem. That is the accordance of thought with things. Now Heidegger points out that the agreement of thought and thing presupposes a prior disclosure of beings, das Seiende, in the openness of the unconcealment of being. Therefore, the openness of the unconcealment of being is a more fundamental kind of truth than truth as an attribute of thought, its accordance with things. The accordance of thought with things is a derivative form of truth. In the disclosure of beings in the openness of the unconcealment of being lies the ground of both truth and freedom. To free, in its original sense, is to save. It is what the victor in a war does in its generosity, in his generosity, insofar as indeed he has generosity. To free is to save, and that is to let the being who is freed simply be, in accordance with its own way to be. All right? To free is to let a being be in accordance with its own way to be. The essence of freedom, therefore, and here I quote Heidegger, is the capacity to free. It is from the capacity to free that springs the freeing of anything. Of all beings, Seiende, man alone was granted the capacity to let be, the capacity to free, to let himself be, and to let all other beings other than himself as well be. This capacity to let be is, of course, always dependent upon the simultaneous gift of being, das Sein, something over which man has no power. Right? My capacity to let be depends upon the simultaneous gift of being. Therefore, I depend in my humanity upon the gift of being. That is the other sense of the relation between being and man. We have focused so far on the other direction of that relation. Man, therefore, alone is charged with the guardianship of the openness of the clearing, that is, with the guardianship of freedom. We, you and I, each individually, are thus faced with the necessity of a decision regarding freedom. Either we remain committed to freedom in the Kantian sense of freedom of the will, and so we condemn ourselves to servitude in the exclusive service of technique, the will to master nature. Or we grasp the essence of Das Gestell and surrender all thought of the absolute self-determination of the will, be it that of the individual or that of a people. We are to let go of such thoughts as autonomy, self-determination, democracy, sovereignty. All this is to be left behind, which is not to say that they cease to exist. It is to say that they lose their standing as the ultimate ground of ourselves and being as a whole. We shall then have freed ourselves to place ourselves in the service of freedom proper, as guardianship of the unconcealment of being. The destiny of freedom, which was our topic for these 2 hours, is therefore at stake in this decision. No one knows how it will be made, or when, or by whom. It may take centuries, millennia, before it happens. Nevertheless, that is the destiny of freedom, and therefore our own as well, insofar as freedom, as the capacity to free, belongs uniquely to us. I have said all I had planned to say, and Roger will preside over the questions.
Thank you, Philippe.